Every spring, across the ridges and hollows of the Ozark Plateau, a transformation unfolds that's repeated itself for tens of thousands of years. Bare gray canopies burst into color almost overnight. The forest floor, still littered with last year's leaves, erupts in blooms. Streams run full and cold from April rains. Yet, look closely, and what appears to be a single green wall of forest is actually a mosaic of dozens of distinct tree species, each with its own schedule, its own strategy, its own ecological story. Welcome to this module on Ozark trees in the spring, part of the Ozark Ecology Course series found in the Herbal Database. I'm glad you're here because spring is arguably the best season to understand how this forest works. In this video, we'll achieve 5 key learning objectives. First, you'll be able to identify the dominant and characteristic trees of the Ozark Plateau during spring phenological stages. Second, you'll understand the ecological drivers of spring leaf out and flowering, why trees don't all wake up at the same time. Third, you'll explore the unique relationships between spring trees, pollinators, and wildlife. Fourth, we'll examine how Ozark trees compare to eastern deciduous forests and Great Plains woodlands. What makes this region distinct? And finally, fifth, you'll develop skills for field identification using spring-specific characteristics like emerging leaves, flowers, and bark. Before we dive into individual trees, let's orient ourselves. The Ozark Plateau is one of North America's oldest upland regions, an ancient dome of chert, limestone, and sandstone. It's been dissected by rivers over hundreds of millions of years into the rugged hills and clear water streams that we see today. The region spans southern Missouri, northwest and north central Arkansas, and the northeastern corner of Oklahoma, with outliers into Kansas and Illinois. This topographic complexity, the valleys, bluffs, south-facing slopes, and north-facing hollows, creates a patchwork of microclimates that supports extraordinary tree diversity for a region this far inland. We see species here that are more typical of the Appalachians, others from the Great Plains, and others found almost nowhere else on Earth. Phenology, from the Greek phenion, meaning to appear, is the study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena. For trees, spring phenology includes the timing of bud break, leaf emergence, flowering, and pollination. These events aren't random. They're tightly governed by environmental cues, primarily temperature and daily. In the Ozarks, winter dormancy is broken by the accumulation of warmth, specifically the sum of daily temperature units above a baseline threshold, often 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Foresters and ecologists call this accumulation growing degree days. Different tree species respond to different growing degree day thresholds, which is why the forest wakes up in layers rather than all at once. Think of spring leaf out in the Ozarks as a 3-act play. Each act is roughly 2 to 4 weeks long, unfolding from late February into early May. Act 1 belongs to the early risers, trees that flower before their leaves emerge, or sometimes even the full winter truly ends. The silver maple, Acer saccharinum, is often the first tree to bloom in the Ozarks. Its tiny reddish-purple flowers appearing as early as late February along streams and river bottoms. Close behind is the red maple, Acer rubrum, which lights up the roadsides with orange-red flower clusters that give the species its name long before a single leaf is visible. Eastern red cedar, though technically an evergreen, begins to release enormous clouds of yellow pollen in late February and early March, turning fence lines and roadsides golden and triggering the misery of cedar fever across the region. The elms, American elm, Ulmus americana, and slippery elm, Ulmus rubra, flower quietly in late February to early March, their small winged seeds ripening and dispersing even before leaf-out is complete. Act 2 is the dramatic peak of Ozark spring, and this is the period most people associate with the season. A cascading wave of flowers and emerging leaves that transforms the forest in a matter of days. One of the most spectacular events is the flowering of the eastern redbud, Cercis canadensis, the Missouri state tree. From mid-March through April, redbuds explode in magenta pink blossoms directly from their branches and trunks. That's a phenomenon called cauliflowering that's unusual in temperate trees. In the Ozarks, redbuds are everywhere. Woodland edges, roadsides, rocky glades, stream banks, and their bloom coincides almost perfectly with the emerging white flowers of serviceberry, Amelanchier arborea, creating one of the region's most beloved visual spectacles. The flowering dogwood, Cornus florida, follows closely behind, typically peaking in early to mid-April. What appear to be large white petals are actually modified leaves called bracts, surrounding a cluster of tiny true flowers. The dogwood's timing is ecologically significant. It blooms just as many neotropical migrant birds arrive in the Ozarks, providing critical early season fruit for those completing their long journey north. The oaks, which dominate the Ozark canopy, are wind pollinated, releasing long drooping clusters of flowers called catkins throughout March and April. White oak, Quercus alba, post oak, Quercus stellata, and black oak, Quercus velutina, all begin leafing out in this period. Their emerging leaves, often bronze or reddish before maturing to green, are a characteristic that experienced naturalists use for identification. By mid to late April, Act 3 begins. The fast-growing species complete their leaf-out and the canopy begins to close. The light available on the forest floor, which had surged during early spring, begins to diminish rapidly as leaf area overhead expands. This closing window of light drives a frenzy of activity among spring ephemeral wildflowers below. But it also shapes the competitive dynamics among tree seedlings. Late leafers include the black walnut, Juglans nigra, often among the very last trees to leaf out, sometimes not until early May, and the sycamore, Platanus occidentalis, whose enormous leaves unfurl along river bottoms. The shagbark hickory, Carya ovata, also leaves out late. Its distinctive braided bark making it one of the Ozarks' most recognizable trees, even in winter. The staggered timing of spring phenology isn't just aesthetically pleasing, it has profound ecological consequences. Each species that blooms early has access to pollinators without competition from later blooming species. Winged pollinated trees, the oaks, hickories, elms, benefit from leafing out before their own foliage blocks pollen dispersal. Trees that leaf out early capture more sunlight during the period of high spring insolation, but they also risk frost damage to tender new growth. Climate change is already altering Ozark phenology. Research at Missouri and Arkansas field stations has documented that spring leaf out is occurring 5 to 10 days earlier than it did 50 years ago. This shift can decouple the carefully synchronized timing between trees, their pollinators, and the migratory animals that depend on them, what ecologists call phenological mismatch. If you spend any time in the Ozarks, you quickly realize this is oak hickory country. These two genera dominate the canopy across the vast majority of the plateau, accounting for anywhere between 60 to 80% of the canopy cover in mature upland forests. Understanding oaks and hickories in spring is, in many ways, understanding the Ozark forest itself. The white oak, Quercus alba, is arguably the single most important tree in the Ozark ecosystem. It can live for 500 years or more, grow to a height of 100 feet, and its acorns, which mature in a single year, are among the highest quality mast in eastern North America. Deer, wild turkey, squirrels, blue jays, and wood ducks, and dozens of other species depend heavily on white oak acorns for fall and winter nutrition. In spring, white oak emerges with leaves that are initially bronze to pinkish, a characteristic immediately useful for identification. The mature white oak leaf, with its rounded lobes and no bristle tips, is one of the most distinctive in the oak family. The catkins, which are male flowers, are long, slender, and yellow-green, drooping from the branch tips in March and April. The tiny, inconspicuous female flowers are clustered at the base of new leaves, waiting for wind-carried pollen. On an ecological note, white oak supports more insect species than almost any other North American tree genus. Studies by entomologist Doug Talami and colleagues have documented that native oaks host over 500 species of moth and butterfly caterpillars alone. In spring, the forest canopy is alive with these caterpillars, which in turn support the explosion of insect-eating birds during breeding season. The oak isn't merely a tree, it's a community. If the white oak is the generalist king of the Ozark forest, post oak, Quercus stellata, is the specialist of the harshest sites. It thrives on rocky, shallow, south-facing slopes and glade margins where few other trees can survive. Its tolerance for drought and poor soils is exceptional, a trait linked to deep root systems that can penetrate fractured chert and limestone. Post-oak spring emergence is easy to recognize once you know the trick. The leaves are shaped like a cross, or a Maltese cross, 3 large lobes at the tip and 2 smaller lobes below, creating a distinctive cruciform silhouette. The emerging leaves in spring are covered in tawny to brownish hairs, which give the canopy a warm, dusty appearance from a distance. Like white oak, post oak's acorns mature in one season and are critical fall mast, particularly in the rocky uplands where other hard mast sources are sparse. The Ozarks also support several members of the red oak group, species whose acorns require 2 years to mature, and whose leaf lobes end in bristle tips rather than rounded points. Black oak, Quercus velutina, is widespread across upland sites, and in spring its emerging leaves have a characteristic shiny, almost metallic quality, often reddish, that distinguishes it from white oaks. Scarlet oak, Quercus coccinea, is less common across the Ozarks than in parts of the Appalachians, but it is present on sandy or acidic soils in parts of the Arkansas Ozarks. It's best known for its blazing red fall color, but in spring it's identifiable by its deeply cut C-shaped sinuses between the lobes. The indentations between leaf lobes go nearly to the central rib, creating a lacy skeletal appearance in emerging leaves. Hickories are the oak's inseparable companions in the Ozark canopy. 4 species dominate: shagbark hickory, Carya ovata, mockernut hickory, Carya tomentosa, black hickory, Carya texana, and bitternut hickory, Carya cordiformis. Each occupies a slightly different niche. Shagbark hickory is the most immediately recognizable tree in any season, thanks to its extraordinary shaggy plated bark, long strips that curve outward at the ends, giving the trunk the appearance of a perpetually peeling tree. In spring, shagbark is among the last trees to leaf out, but when it does, its large compound leaves, typically 5 to 7 leaflets, unfurl dramatically and are covered in fine hairs when young. Mockernut hickory, by contrast, leafs out earlier and has large fragrant leaves. Crushing a young mockernut leaf releases a spicy resinous scent. Bitternut hickory favors moist sites along stream bottoms, and its spring buds are bright sulfur yellow, one of the most distinctive winter and early spring identification features of any Ozark tree. Ecologically, hickory nuts are among the highest calorie foods available to Ozark wildlife. Squirrels are perhaps the most important hickory dispersers. They cache thousands of nuts in the fall and fail to retrieve many of them, and thus they plant new trees across the forest. This squirrel-hickory partnership has shaped the composition of Ozark forests for thousands of years. In a mature Ozark forest, the canopy oaks and hickories take center stage, but it's the understory, the layer of smaller trees growing beneath the canopy, that provides much of the ecological complexity, spring visual drama, and habitat structure for wildlife. Learning to see and identify the understory is what separates the casual observer from the true student of the Ozark forest. We introduced the redbud earlier in our phenology discussion, but this magnificent tree deserves deeper attention. Eastern redbud, Cercis canadensis, has a nearly perfect ecological story for the Ozark spring. It blooms before its leaves emerge, so the flowers are unobstructed by foliage, maximizing their visibility to pollinators.
The flowers are rich in nectar and are visited by native bees, especially bumblebees, mining bees, and the specialist redbud bee, Osmia ribiflorus. Redbud is also exceptional because it's a legume, a member of the bean family, which means its roots harbor nitrogen-fixing bacteria. In the nutrient-poor soils common on Ozark slopes, this ability to pull atmospheric nitrogen into the soil makes redbud a genuine ecosystem engineer, gradually enriching the soil around it. After the flowers fade in April, the heart-shaped leaves emerge, initially reddish or purplish, maturing to glossy green. By late spring and summer, the tree is covered in flat, papery seed pods that rattle in the wind and persist into winter. Redbud is native across the Ozarks and found in every county, from rocky glades to rich bottomlands. No tree is more iconic to the Ozark spring than the flowering dogwood, Cornus florida. It occupies a fascinating ecological position. Too shade tolerant to compete for the canopy, it's evolved to thrive as a permanent understory tree, capturing light through its horizontal branching pattern, which spaces its leaves to minimize self-shading. The dogwood's white petals are, as mentioned, actually bracts, modified leaves, that evolved to attract pollinators to the small, rather inconspicuous true flowers in the center. This is a remarkably efficient strategy. The bracts require less metabolic investment than true petals, but do the same advertising job. The flowers are visited by a wide range of early pollinators, including native bees and flies. Dogwood is deeply susceptible to a fungal disease called dogwood anthracnose, Discula destructiva, which has devastated dogwood populations across the Appalachians since the 1970s. In the Ozarks, the impact has been present, but somewhat less severe. The drier climate and more open forests appear to provide partial protection. Still, monitoring dogwood health is an important conservation priority across the region. Serviceberry, known variously as Juneberry, shadblow, or sarviceberry, is a group of closely related species in the genus Amelanchier, of which Amelanchier arborea, the downy serviceberry, is the most common in the Ozarks. It blooms in late March to early April, often simultaneously with redbud, and its white flowers against still bare gray canopy create one of the most quietly beautiful sights in the Ozark spring. The name serviceberry has a pragmatic origin. The trees bloom in the Ozarks at the same time the ground first thaws enough to dig graves, allowing burial services that have been delayed through winter. The fruit, small, dark purple, sweet berries, ripening in June, are among the best wild fruits in the region, prized by humans and irresistible to birds, especially neotropical migrants moving through in late spring. The pawpaw, Asmina triloba, is genuinely strange, a member of the custard apple family, which is otherwise almost entirely tropical. It has no close relatives in North America except in the subtropical southeast. Yet, there it stands in Ozark Creek bottoms and rich north-facing slopes with enormous leaves up to a foot long that give the grove a subtropical appearance. In spring, the pawpaw flowers in April with a small, maroon, fleshy flower that hangs below the branches. These flowers are pollinated by flies and beetles, attracted by their faint smell of rotting flesh, an unusual adaptation. The fruit, which ripens in September, is the largest edible fruit native to North America. Creamy and sweet, tasting of banana custard mixed with mango. Pawpaw groves spread clonally through root sprouts, so what appears to be a stand of separate trees is often a single genetic individual. Along Ozark rivers and streams, the forest composition changes dramatically. The floodplain and riparian zones support different species entirely. Trees adapted to periodic flooding, high moisture, and the constant disturbance of river dynamics. The American sycamore, Platanus occidentalis, is the giant of Ozark river bottoms. Its upper bark exfoliates in irregular patches to reveal brilliant white, cream, and tan surfaces underneath, making it one of the most visually striking trees in any season. In late spring, sycamore produces enormous leaves, up to a foot across, and ball-shaped fruit clusters that hang on the tree through winter. Sycamores are among the largest diameter trees in eastern North America, and they provide critical nesting habitat for chimney swifts, wood ducks, and great-crested flycatchers. Eastern cottonwood, Populus deltoides, is another giant of Ozark River corridors. Its spring catechins are among the earliest to emerge, and in May and June, the female trees release extraordinary quantities of cottony seeds that drift through the air like snow, landing on moist sandbars and germinating almost immediately. Cottonwood seedlings must germinate on bare, moist substrate within days of release, a tight ecological requirement that makes the species dependent on the natural flood disturbance dynamics that create and renew sandbars. Spring is the season when the tree-wildlife relationship is most visible and most intense. As trees leaf out and flower, the entire food web above the soil comes alive. Understanding this web is essential to understanding why Ozark forest conservation matters. Let's start with deadwood. Living forests are full of dead trees. Standing snags and fallen logs that are critical habitat. At least a quarter of all Ozark forest wildlife species depend on cavities or deadwood at some life stage. In spring, woodpeckers, pileated, red-headed, hairy, downy, are excavating new cavities or enlarging old ones. These cavities will be used not only by the excavating woodpeckers, but by secondary cavity nesters like wood ducks, screech owls, flying squirrels, bluebirds, and many others. The oak snag is not a dead tree. It's an apartment complex. One of the most ecologically important events of Ozark Spring is largely invisible until you look closely at the undersides of emerging oak leaves, the annual caterpillar explosion. The sudden abundance of moth and butterfly larvae feeding on newly emerged foliage represents an enormous pulse of protein and energy moving through the forest food web. Oaks are the foundation of this system. As Doug Talami's research has shown, Native oaks support more caterpillar biomass than any other native tree genus. A single large white oak may support tens of thousands of caterpillars in a peak spring week. These caterpillars are the primary food source for breeding songbirds, and critically, for the nestlings of species like the black and white warbler, the great crested flycatcher, and the wood thrush, which cannot feed their chicks anything but soft, protein-rich caterpillars. The timing synchrony here is extraordinary and fragile. The caterpillar peak in the Ozarks typically occurs in late April to early May, coinciding precisely with peak songbird breeding and peak nestling demand. If oak leaf-out shifts earlier due to climate warming, but bird migration and breeding schedules, which are controlled more by day length than temperature, don't shift correspondingly, the result is a mismatch. Nestlings hatch after the caterpillar peak has passed. This phenological mismatch is already affecting bird population trends across eastern North America. The flowering sequence of Ozark spring trees creates a staggered, overlapping supply of nectar and pollen for pollinators. A buffet table that extends from late February into May. This floral progression isn't accidental. The diversity of bloom times has co-evolved with the diversity of pollinator species and their life cycles. Early blooming trees, like the silver maple, red maple, elm, are critical for queen bumblebees that emerged from winter dormancy and need immediate food resources. Later bloomers, redbud, wild plum, wild cherry, black haw viburnum, support the full diversity of spring active native bees. Ozark researchers have documented over 400 native bee species in the region, ranging from tiny sweat bees and mining bees to large caterpillar bees and bumblebees. Wild cherry and wild plum, both present in the Ozarks as native species, Prunus serratina, the black cherry, and Prunus americana, the American plum, are exceptional spring bloomers that provide both nectar-rich flowers and, later in the season, fruit that fuels southbound migrant birds in the late summer. The Ozark Plateau isn't just a collection of widespread eastern species. It's also home to a significant number of endemic or near-endemic plants and distinctive ecological communities found nowhere else. The combination of ancient, stable upland terrain, varied bedrock, and geographic isolation has generated biological diversity over deep time. Two tree species deserve special attention: the Ozark chinkapin, Castanea ozarkensis, related to the American chestnut, is a small tree found on dry slopes in the Arkansas and Missouri Ozarks and virtually nowhere else on Earth. It was hit hard by the chestnut blight, but is recovering in some areas. The Arkansas oak, Quercus arkansana, is another rare endemic, found primarily in sandy soils in the Arkansas Ozarks and adjacent areas. Both are conservation priorities and represent the irreplaceable biological heritage of this region. If you've done any tree identification, you know that most field guides show mature summer leaves. Spring presents a different challenge, and in some ways a richer one. Emerging leaves are often different in shape, color, texture, and hairiness from their mature summer form. Flowers are present on species that are easy to identify, but can also confirm identification of tricky species. And phenological timing itself, which species is leaping out when, becomes a clue. Flowers are the most dramatic and often most distinctive spring identification feature. Here are a few key examples. If you see a small to medium tree covered in magenta pink flowers in March or early April, before the leaves emerge, that's almost certainly eastern redbud. Nothing else in the Ozarks looks quite like it. White flowers blooming against bare gray forest in late March to early April, serviceberry. Serviceberry has 5 narrow, slightly twisted looking petals. Flowering dogwood has 4 large, notched rounded bracts. Yellow drooping catechins on a tree along a stream in late February or March are likely silver or red maple with their distinctive flower colors, or willow. Many trees have distinctive emerging leaf colors that differ from their mature green. Bronze to pinkish emerging leaves on the upland forest, often white oak. Shiny, almost metallic reddish leaves, often black oak. Leaves covered in dense white or silver hairs, often white oak, but also sycamore, which is distinctive by its enormous size. Tawny, brown, hairy emerging leaves, the post oak. Purplish to red, redbud, or sometimes red maple. Bark doesn't change seasonally, so it's a reliable year-round identification feature, and especially helpful in early spring when leaves are just emerging. Shagbark hickory has that unmistakable plated shaggy bark. Sycamore's white upper bark is visible from hundreds of meters. Black walnut has distinctive interlocking ridges forming a diamond pattern. Red maple often has smooth, light gray bark on young trees and branches. So learning to identify trees by bark makes you a more capable year-round naturalist. Just before and at leaf out, bud characteristics are useful. Bitternut hickory's sulphur yellow buds are unmistakable, visible from a distance. Shagbark hickory has large, chunky buds with loosely overlapping scales. Walnut has large, tan, velvety buds at branch tips. Red maple buds are clustered in small groups at the branch tips, each bud small and red. White oak buds are clustered at branch tips and tan to reddish brown without visible hair. The best way to develop spring identification skills is to visit the same forest repeatedly throughout the spring season, ideally every week or two from late February through early May. Keep a simple journal, date, temperature, what you saw blooming or leafing out. Over 2 or 3 springs, you'll develop an intuitive sense of the seasonal rhythm that no field guide can fully provide. The Ozark spring is fast. Blink, and the redbuds have gone from bud to full leaf. So regular, short visits beat a single long visit every time. The trees of the Ozark spring are more than a checklist of species. They're a living calendar, a food web, a climate record, and a cultural touchstone. The redbud that blooms at the same time every year in your neighborhood is connected through networks of soil fungi and shared pollinators to the white oaks on the ridge above, to the wood thrush that needs oak caterpillars to feed its chicks, to the bumblebee that needs the redbud nectar after a long winter. When we learn to recognize these species and understand their ecological roles, we don't just accumulate natural history facts. We develop a way of seeing the world. The Ozark forest isn't a static backdrop to human activity. It's a dynamic, interconnected, and ancient system that's been shaped by fire, flooding, ice ages, and the long coevolution of species, and that's now being shaped by human land use and a changing climate. The Ozark Plateau contains some of the most important remaining areas of oak hickory forest in North America. It's also one of the most threatened, with forest fragmentation, invasive species, including the emerald ash borer, now devastating native ash trees across the region, and climate-driven shifts in species ranges, all presenting serious challenges. Knowing these trees by name, by ecology, by their place in the seasonal cycle, is the foundation of effective conservation. You can't protect what you can't recognize or value. Ozark Spring is a gift that's both ancient and, in its current form, fragile. Our understanding of it's both a privilege and a responsibility. Before you go, I'd encourage you to step outside wherever you are and look at the trees around you with the eyes you've been developing in this module. Ask, is this species native? When does it bloom? What is eating it, and what eats that? The questions are simple, but the answers go deep. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention, and I'll see you in the next video.